New Zealand has a legacy of deadly disasters.
I knew my brother and my father were dead. I just knew.
Disasters that have shaped our country.
A catastrophic earthquake hit Hawke's Bay.
A deadly influenza virus swept throughout the world.
The SS Wairarapa slammed straight into the northern tip of Great Barrier Island.
6 celebrated New Zealanders retrace some of this country's darkest days, bringing history alive through the eyes of descendants.
I could hear people screaming and crying and yelling. The stench was so bad. You could smell death.
It was my Uncle Kevin. He said there's been an explosion in the mine.
On a bitterly cold Central Otago afternoon in June 1943, the passenger express from Cromwell to Dunedin was running 10 minutes late. By the time it left Hyde Station, 113 people were on board. Then, in a remote cutting 6 miles down the track, disaster struck. The engine derailed, dragging 7 carriages with it. "21 people were dead and dozens injured. It took over for help to arrive. Those who survived were left cold, tired, and struggling to fend for themselves in amongst the mangled wreckage. The blame for the crash was laid squarely on the driver, Jack Corcoran. But how did a man with such experience fail his passengers so badly? What happened here in 1943 on this part of Central Otago's old railway line is part of this region's history. It's also a part of mine. For 13 years I played rugby for Otago, and I own an historic cottage in the area. For me, it's my spiritual homeland, where I feel most like a New Zealander. I want to know what happened that day, and how this tragic event has affected individuals, families, and the greater community. Almost forgotten, it is New Zealand's second deadliest rail disaster. When the Otago Central Line was established in 1885, it transformed a remote frontier region into one of the most productive farming areas in New Zealand. During the early period of the 20th century, Central Otago grew into a breadbasket for the country and the world. Much of this unique history has been preserved here at the Otago Film Heritage. In 1943, New Zealand found itself in the middle of a treacherous war. Shortages were everywhere, and everyone was being pressured to work still harder to assist with the war effort. There was very little time for recreation. On the morning of June 4th that year, David Connor, his father and brother John, made their way to Kokona Station on foot after being held up by a flat tyre. Meanwhile, at the next station in Hyde, 9-year-old Valerie Smolensky arrived on the platform with plenty of time to spare for her trip to Dunedin. And back at Ranfurly, driver Jack Corcoran was preparing to start his shift. He was taking charge of the Cromwell to Dunedin Express for the next leg of its journey. It was King's birthday weekend. Everyone was looking forward to a well-deserved midwinter's break. For many people, it would be the first opportunity to get away from the area since the war had started. 9-year-old David was the second son of Thomas Connor. He was embarking on an exciting trip to the annual winter show in Dunedin. It would be David's first time on a train.
Yeah, this is the same sort of carriage, Anton, exactly the same as this. I remember that we were sitting here, I was sitting there, my brother next to me and my father across here.
Less than an hour earlier, David, his mother, father and brother had piled into the family car and headed for Kokona train station.
I remember the wee Hillman mix. It was a lovely little car because it was fairly new. My father would be driving the car, and Mum was the passenger, and of course we were in the back. Just not far out of Kokona, a wee Hillman Minx got a flat tyre.
With no time to fix the puncture and still catch the train, they'd have to leave Mum with the car and go on by foot.
Right, boys, get your bags.
My dad was panicking, so we hightailed it down the road and climbed across the fence at the bottom of the hill. Well, I didn't climb it, I went through it. I was just a little fellow and I was able to get through between the wires, but my father and my brother had to climb over the top of it. It was rusty old wire, rusty old barb.
I've just got this image of a dad and his two kids scrambling over an open field with their luggage.
Well, it was a bank. We had to climb up a bank.
Right. What the Connors didn't know was back at Ranfurly Station, locomotive AB 782 had also been delayed. Extra carriages were needed to cope with the large number of passengers. And when shift driver Jack Corcoran jumped on board, it was running 10 minutes late.
Because the train was late, we were there on time. And we weren't there for very long. I don't remember standing on the platform for any length of time before the train arrived.
Immediately upon leaving Kokona, the train gained speed. Next stop was Hyde Station.
I remember the train going very fast because luggage was, even you could feel it or hear it falling in some places in the carriage, and the carriage was rocking around quite severely. Then, first time on a train, being a young fellow, I didn't know whether that was natural or not. I got the feeling that my father, who was sitting opposite, he was getting more concerned. He was getting quieter. Instead of chatting away like a family we would have been, he was getting more concerned about the way things were going.
However, the pace didn't let up. At 1:37 p.m, after the train had left Hyde, the driver still appeared to be hell-bent on making up time.
There was tension in the carriage. I can remember reading the sign on the wall about the emergency stop and the fine was £10. I read that notice several times on the way down. And I guess, in hindsight, that was why nobody stopped the train that day, because of the deterrent of the fine.
No one did pull that emergency brake. And moments later...
I don't remember any crash or anything. I don't remember anything. It just went black.
At 1:40 p.m, locomotive AB 782 left the track. After sliding 60 metres around a deep straw cutting 6 miles south of Hyde, it came to an abrupt halt. The boiler burst, extinguishing the fire in the box, but severely scalding the fireman and driver. All 7 passenger carriages had left the track, smashing into the back of each other and piling up around the engine. The force of the crash was such that the undercarriage of one was twisted into the form of an S. All that remained on the tracks were 2 goods wagons and the guard's van.
The next thing I remember is waking up under all this rubble, lying on my back and amongst all this wreckage, and knowing that things were not good. Well, I was conscious for a long time, people moving around up above were knocking debris down and it was landing on my face and in my eyes and in my mouth and whatnot, and it was pretty disturbing.
David lay in the wreckage for hours, alone, in the dark.
I knew my brother and my father were dead. I couldn't see them, but I just knew. Whether I'd tried to talk to them or whether I'd yelled out or what, I don't know. The last memory I have is my father sitting there and my brother sitting here. I never ever saw them after that. The most vivid memory of my brother was he building a wee aeroplane, a model aeroplane out of wood. And we were down in the shed and he was always mucking around with this model aeroplane cutting and sawing and planing and whatnot. He was a wee bit older than me.
Thomas and John were just 2 of 21 people that would die in the wreckage of the Cromwell to Dunedin Express. And the Connors were one of many families whose lives were torn apart by that horrific accident. When locomotive AB 782 left the rails that fateful day in June 1943, it changed the lives of all those who were on board. This question asked was, why was the driver going so fast? No one knows more about these trains or what it took to drive them than Russell Glendinning.
Engines are always shoes.
You call an engine a
It's
shoe?
always a her because they're temperamental, bloody old bitches. We wouldn't. But you don't say that in front of women, of course.
No, of course not.
No, they're always called. Steam engines are always a her. Oh. Only the senior crews got on passenger trains. You worked up the ranks from the bottom to the top. And the passenger trains were the responsibility of the top drivers. So the time you got there, you were supposed to be experienced enough to handle it.
And how long would that transition take?
Usually about 17 years.
Jack Corcoran had worked for the railways for 35 years, many of those as a senior driver. He had driven the Otago Central Line route many times, so knew it well. I asked Russell what he thought caused the crash.
I don't think there's any debate about the speed of the train. I do believe that the train was going faster than what it should have. But...
And that's why it derailed?
Well, that's what they put it down to. That's the same train on the same spot.
That's not very tight turn at all. And it just basically kept going straight then. It just didn't have...
Probably what happened was the tender probably derailed first and pulled the engine to the side of the cutting like that, and the train ran into it.
So it's a bit like a trailer. If the trailer jackknifes, then it takes the engine off with it.
Exactly.
What are the other reasons why it would have come off that track if it wasn't speed? If it
Well,
was going
there's
the
things
correct
like, I
speed...
mean, there could be a track defect, which obviously there wasn't from all accounts. It could have been broken rail, or it could have been something defect on the locomotive itself. I don't know.
The initial investigation found no reason other than speed. And when it was discovered that Jack Corcoran had been drinking that morning in the Ranfurly Hotel, his fate was sealed.
The indications are that he wasn't drunk.
Yeah.
And if anybody on that train had concerns about the speed of that train, you think they would have pulled the emergency brake. Now, why didn't somebody do it?
Yeah.
And that's the question we as railwaymen asked each other.
Yeah.
An eyewitness account noted someone did approach Corcoran at the Hyde Township stop to question his speed. But who really was in a position to challenge the driver's authority?
The guard was theoretically in charge of the train, but the driver has got the ultimate responsibility. The train doesn't go unless the driver makes it go.
So if I'm the train driver and you're the guard, and you're seeing that I'm starting to drive recklessly or in a way that you don't think safe, what would you do to me?
You would point out at some stage that I think what you're doing was not kosher or not according to the book.
Right.
And we better rectify it. But that's as far as it could go.
How the hell can you have that conversation?
Well, in those days, you couldn't. You had to make the conversation before you left. And you had no further communication until you stopped at the next station. But if the guard had concerns about the speed of the train, I'm sure he would have pulled the emergency brake on.
Yeah.
And the question should be asked, why didn't he?
For the survivors, like Valerie Smolensky, who caught the train from Hyde, it's the actions of the driver on that terrible day that are remembered most.
Why do you think the train crashed that day?
Excessive speed. And I do believe that the driver was intoxicated. One was standing there waiting to wave to me, and normally the drivers were very friendly and they would wave. She said he didn't look sideways, he was just focused straight ahead and determined to get on with the job and get the train down the line as fast as possible. I was 9 and nearly 10.
Nearly 10.
And I was going to Dunedin that day to stay with my aunt for the weekend. I walked across the railway line and stood on the platform here, and there was Mr. and Mrs. Beale, who were the parents of my very best friend at school. There was Mrs. Ward and her little daughter. They were neighbours of ours who lived just along at the end of the row of houses.
The Smolensky family had moved to Hyde in the summer of 1936. Valerie's father worked as a linesman for the railways, and they lived just across the tracks from the Hyde train station. It was the winter show weekend, and her parents had agreed to let Valerie travel on her own to Dunedin. The Cromwell to Dunedin Express had pulled into Hyde Station at 1:34 that afternoon.
We noticed pretty soon that the train was going very fast. It had come fast into the station. It had overrun the station, actually, and we had to walk down the track a bit to get on the train. But it was swaying madly all the way down. I wasn't frightened. Lots of people were, but I was too young and silly, I suppose, to feel frightened.
Had you been on a train before?
Oh, we'd travelled all the time on the train.
Okay, so you knew, you kind of knew what was sort of fast and what wasn't.
Yes, I knew it was going far too fast. Yeah. And when we got to the viaduct, what we called the Big Black Bridge, which is just before where the accident occurred, it was really swaying, and I remember Mrs. Beale saying, "Shit, he's cutting it." And it was just after that we entered the cutting where the accident occurred, and I remember the carriage leaning over. The wheels must have left the rail on the offside because it leant right over, almost to touch the bank. Then it straightened up. And then I don't remember anymore. It was just everything went black.
The Cromwell to Dunedin Express had crashed, with 113 passengers on board. 9-year-old Valerie had been catapulted from her seat in the third carriage into the tender just behind the engine.
I remember waking up in the back of the engine, and I was head first down. And there was blood pouring out of my leg onto my chin, running up my face and dripping onto my hands below. And I had coal and wood all around me, and there was a broken steam pipe just below me. But fortunately, the steam was hitting a board and hissing along underneath instead of coming up, otherwise I would have been badly burnt. I could hear people screaming and crying and yelling. I was sure I'd died and gone to hell. So I had to be in hell, didn't I, with all that going on? And I was thinking, I haven't been this bad. Why should I be in hell? Until, after a while, I don't know how long it was, I could feel the boards moving. Every time I kicked to move myself, to try and get myself out, the boards just packed more tightly around me. Until I found them being pulled away, and I sort of looked up under my arm and I could see the sky. And I could see 3 men silhouetted against the sky, all looking exactly the same, looking down at me. And I don't remember anymore, but it was only one man I was seeing in triplicate by that time.
Passengers from the rear carriages had already clambered forward to help. Valerie was pulled from the wreckage.
So the next thing I remembered, I was lying on the bank with all the dead and the injured all around me. I could see Mrs. Beale lying not far from me, and I could see Mrs. Ward lying on a railway carriage door. There was a man lying right beside me who was dead and badly mutilated, covered in an army greatcoat, and people kept on coming along and lifting it up to see who it was. And so I saw him lots of times.
Immediately after the crash, survivors had done all they could for the injured and dead. As the afternoon wore on and cold set in, they wondered how long it would take for help to arrive. At 40 minutes past 1 on a cold winter's afternoon, the Cromwell to Dunedin Express had derailed 6 minutes south of Hyde Station. 67 people were trapped, injured and dying. A nearby farmer was the first to arrive on the scene, only to find his own son's body in amongst the wreckage. He then rode 1.5 kilometres to telephone for help.
Trains were meant to be very safe things that travelled on a rail, never went off, they were always safe. And here was this smashed up thing that had been a train, and the engine lying against the bank on the far side like a wounded dragon, puffing out a bit of steam every now and then, and the hissing of the steam and the crying and the yelling. It was unbelievable. The local farmers brought their hay bales along, and they put them between the train and the bank, so it sort of, there wasn't that big dip there. So
You sort of clamber up then,
So
did you?
they were able to, as they were rescuing people, they just carried them across the straw and they didn't have so far to climb.
Word of the derailment reached the train running office in Dunedin at 1:55 p.m. Soon after, a team of linesmen working 4 miles north of Middlemarch were dispatched to the scene. In that team was Valerie Spolensky's father.
Cecil Ward usually drove the trolley for the Hyde people, and he knew his wife and daughter were on the train, and he was just so nervous he couldn't start the trolley. So Dad kick-started it, and he said he had the throttle wide open all the way, but they seemed to be crawling. And he was sort of thinking, the train's only derailed, it'll be all right. Until they got within view of straw cutting, and the first thing they saw was the smashed carriage up on the top of the cutting. And he thought, oh, this is more than a derailment. And then they got up further and they could see a carriage in front of the engine smashed to smithereens, and the engine lying on the bank. And all these carriages, where there were 4 carriages piled up, he said, it was such a small space, you'd never believe that there were 4 carriages in such a small space. And he remembers thinking, there's no way in the world Valerie can be still alive. And he remembers as soon as he stopped the trolley and as soon as it came to a screeching halt, he was off it and up the bank. And he said as soon as he put his head over the bank, he could see me. I was the first one he saw. He said I was sitting up looking as though I was expecting him. And I was, because I'd heard the trolley. I recognised the sound of it, and I said to the man next to me, here's my father. And he was saying, lie down, girlie, because he had all the time.
Valerie's father later wrote about his experience that day.
I didn't know who he was until later, but I found David Connor alive, lying with his father and brother who were already dead. He had a great gash below one knee. It was hard to believe there could be so much flesh hanging out of the gaping hole that was left. I could have put my fist into it. We saw some shocking sights and horrifying injuries that day. It wasn't until I reached home that my emotions got the better of me, and I broke down and cried.
As word of the Hyde Railway disaster spread throughout the district, the Maniatoto Battalion of the Home Guard based in Ranfurly received a call at about 2 p.m. and quickly mobilised its resources. Meanwhile, 6 miles away, 18-year-old junior linesman Jack Pringle and his boss Steve were near the Rockhampilla station repairing phone lines. Not realising the seriousness of the crash, they were sent to retrieve the mail from the guard's van.
Brings back a lot of memories.
Does it?
Certainly does.
What type of memories come back to you?
Well, we were getting up the road in no great hurry, and I saw a cloud of dust coming up behind us, and I said to Steve, there's somebody in a hurry behind us, Steve. The next thing, there was toot, toot, toot on the horn behind us, and we pulled over to let this car past, and Steve said, that's the doctor from Middlemarch. There must be somebody injured in this, what's ever happened up here.
So you had no idea how...
No, we didn't have any idea how serious it was at that stage. When we got to the top of the hill behind us here, there were a lot of people wandering around, people who had already got out of the carriages further back and who were doing their best to help. But it was pretty obvious that it was going to be difficult to get people out of those front 3 carriages. Somebody must have said to me, we've got to get in through the top of that carriage. So Steve, my boss, said to me, go over and get the ladder and bring the axe. And we'll put the ladder from the top of the bank onto the roof of the carriage. I climbed over the ladder onto the roof of the carriage and started to cut a hole in the roof. It took quite a while to cut the hole, and the axe was a bit blunt, I think. Eventually, I succeeded, leant down through the hole and grabbed one of these seats in the carriage to try and make more room to get in, and it was absolutely smothered in blood. It gave me a terrible shock. Unfortunately, the first lady we got out was obviously had died at impact. The next person we got out was a local farmer from Pateroa who I knew. I can't remember how long I stayed there or how long this all took. Some part of the afternoon, I don't know who it was, said, you come down off there, Jack, and somebody else will come in and take over. So I thankfully crawled back over the ladder and walked up towards the back of the train to see if I could help anybody else.
By this time, the full extent of the carnage was starting to sink in for Jack.
There were a lot of people who were in shock, a lot of people who didn't have serious injuries but were hurting. I met an uncle of mine. He had injured his shoulder and he was wandering around in a bit of a daze, and the first thing he said to me, Jack, I've lost my suitcase. Do you think you'd be able to go and find it?
It's almost when you lost your innocence, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that, yeah. Just sitting here just seems so unreal now to me. It was a terrible day for Central Otago.
As the afternoon wore on, the frosty conditions gave way to a misty rain. Blankets, hot water bottles and hay were just some of the items used to comfort the cold, wet and shocked passengers. By early evening, the rescue operation was in full swing. The dead were ferried to the Hyde Hall, which became a makeshift mortuary. The body of the last victim, Mr. Clare, was recovered at 1:10 the following morning. Nothing more could now be done for the dead, but for the injured, a long, uncomfortable journey lay ahead. In a remote cutting just south of Hyde, Central Otago, locomotive AB 782, heading from Cromwell to Dunedin, derailed, killing 21 people. By 7 p.m, most of the survivors had been evacuated. Those who were uninjured and still wanting to continue on to Dunedin were loaded into buses, while private cars, vans and trucks had gathered to take local passengers either home or onto hospital. The butcher's van from Ranfurly had the sombre task of ferrying the dead to a mortuary at Hyde Hall, while a special train service was provided to take more of the injured to Ranfurly Hospital. Two of the patients to arrive at the hospital were Valerie Spalensky and David Connor.
I was put in the Ranfurly grocer's van. I don't know whether I went to sleep, passed out or whatever, but I don't remember much about actually arriving at the hospital. But that's how I got here, was in a bread van.
Ranfurly Hospital normally had accommodation for 19 patients. There were now 32 seriously injured people needing medical attention.
Oh, there were beds in all the corridors. Beds, makeshift beds everywhere.
Amongst all of this chaos was a medical team that was still having to provide critical care. After spending their first days recovering in adult wards, Valerie and David were eventually put in the same room together.
Go on, sit up.
That's when I started telling him stories and singing to him. One of the songs I used to sing was Harbour Lights. And I used to sing a few cowboy songs, and Red Sails in the Sunset was another one.
For the two children, it was the start of a lifelong friendship.
I said to him one day, "What song do you like best?" And he said, "I like that one where you sing, I long to hold you near and kiss you just once more." And I said, "Oh, do you want me to sing it?" He said, "Yes." So I sang it, and I got to the bit where I long to hold you close, and I said, "and kick you just once more." Nasty little creature I was. Yeah. Ree Valerie Smolenski, aged 10 years of Hyde. I understand this child was injured in the railway accident of the 4th of June 43, and that she suffered severely from shock, was crushed and bruised, and the left lower leg was badly gashed. That thigh and the mass that he's talking about, if it had been examined, they would have found, hang on, I've got something here to show you. They would have found a piece of railway carriage.
Good Lord.
That was taken out of my leg 13 years after the accident.
You carried that around in your leg?
I carried it in my
years.
leg for 13 years.
The impact of the Hyde train crash in 1943 was not just restricted to those who were either in the crash or part of the rescue. It also affected the lives of descendants who have lived with the pain and grief of loss. In some cases, that included the loss of the family's breadwinner. Over the 10 weeks David was in hospital, he kept in contact with his family through regular letter writing.
Hello? Anyone home? Hello, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Coleman is David's younger sister. She was 4 years old at the time of the tragedy.
Dear Bubbles, how do you like the snow? It is a foot deep here at the hospital, and I am getting cold writing to you. How is Popeye the cat? I suppose you will have to stay inside all the time, because we were outdoor children. From David. Just from David. And he's done little drawings of Ginty and myself. We were eating tea when the phone rang. I wasn't aware of it, I just knew something had happened. I believe that we were swept up and taken somewhere to stay the night. I do remember asking Mum, well, where are Dad and John? She said to me that they'd gone to heaven because they'd been hurt badly in the accident. And I screamed, because even though she didn't use the word dead, I knew that that was bad, and I could feel her distress, and she clutched me to her when I was crying and said, don't. And that was all the crying that I was allowed to do. My brothers, my David and myself, and little Ginty, he was 20 months old when they were killed, hardly even talking. And Mum was always told to pull herself together. She had the other children to think of.
Really?
Well, somebody said that to her. That's how life was. Don't talk about it, it'll go away. It's like having an elephant in the room and nobody talking about it.
Shortly after the accident, the Connor family were forced to move off the farm and went to stay with relatives in Invercargill.
This calendar, when they moved away from Kyburn, they would have had to pack up the house.
Right.
This would have been on the wall. She's taken it down and kept it.
She's kept it all this
and
time.
it's got some sort of a mark. I think there's been a sticker somewhere there, just between the 3rd and the 4th, possibly for the day that they were going to be catching the train. I came across this.
It's definitely marked the 4th.
It's marked the 4th.
And she's never been able to let it go.
Well, not only that, it's a symbol of what she didn't have and kept what she could.
Right.
And these little things like the gloves.
And the
Look
gloves.
at these
What are
gloves. Beautiful wool, and they've got holes and mended.
Whose gloves are these?
They would have been John's and possibly sent from Invercargill by grandmother.
And these things here?
My father's dog tags for when he...
Okay, they are too, yeah. What do they say?
They've got the Tom Connor, TB Connor, Thomas Black, Otago, NZ, something forces.
So they're very special. They
Yes,
really
I suppose they are. I think all these items are symbolic of my mother's unfinished grief, the grief that she carried. They got on the train and she never saw them again. All the bodies were taken to the Hyde Hall, and she went down and she wasn't allowed to go in. The guy at the door said, "Over my dead body," which wasn't a very nice expression to use. After that, she suffered a lot of depression. She used to call them nervous breakdowns, and nobody knew how to deal with them in those days. She didn't cry because I think it was seen as a form of weakness. And I would say to her, "Mum, let it out, cry."
I would imagine she just felt so terribly isolated.
When the war was over, people were celebrating it, but she couldn't celebrate the war being over because she was still grieving. And she said it didn't take a war to kill my son.
There are so many terrible stories I've lost that fateful day. One elderly passenger's relief at still being alive soon turned to grief when she found that her husband, daughter, and 2 grandchildren had all been killed. An Alexandra passenger had just given up her seat to a woman who was carrying a baby. The mother and child were killed moments later. According to those that were there, the sole cause of the crash was the reckless speed the train was travelling, and that was the responsibility of Jack Corcoran.
Call Jack Corcoran to the stand. Jack Corcoran.
The public wanted answers. On the 7th of September 1943, Corcoran was arrested and appeared before the court on charges of manslaughter. During his trial, the Crown prosecution put their case to the jury.
While you are not required to determine whether Corcoran was drunk, it is absurd to suggest that he was perfectly sober.
When he was questioned about the train's speed, Corcoran replied that he thought it was normal and no different from any of his previous trips. It took a number of days for the jury to reach their verdict.
We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter.
However, they did add a plea to the judge.
We wish to add the strongest recommendation to mercy possible in view of undoubted suffering.
Hi, Pat. How are you?
Patricia Moore has never spoken publicly about the crash. She's agreed to talk to me about the effect it had on her family and the role that Jack Corcoran, her father, played in this tragic accident.
I've got this document here, Patricia. I don't know whether you've seen it before. I was wondering if you could read it out for me.
It's a letter from Dr. Pearman from Christchurch. I have visited JPA Corcoran at the Paparoa jail and find that he has suffered burns of the head and has lost the upper half of the left ear and a small piece of the right ear. He has also suffered a fracture of the left humerus with severe burns of both hands and especially the left upper arm. The burns on the top of the head have now almost healed. He was a good man, he was a hard worker. and he was very popular.
He was also a war veteran, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Jack had served his country during the First World War. A corporal in the Canterbury Regiment, he was seriously wounded at Messines and gassed at Passchendaele.
Did he just love being a train driver?
Well, I think that, you know, if there was work to be done, he would do it. During the Second War, they were very short of staff, and he did a lot of long hours then. And that's possibly, you know, a contributing factor to the accident, I don't know.
What do you think caused the accident?
I don't know.
Don't know?
I don't know. But he got the blame, whatever it was. And I don't know that he was entirely to blame.
Certainly after the incident, the railways didn't support your mum or the family.
They did not.
After the trial, the railways established their own inquiry. There was no plea for mercy from Jack's employers. The most outspoken was the Minister of Railways, Robert Semple, who said, "Thank God the blame of that bad accident cannot be passed on to the Railways Department, as it was due to the stupid conduct of a man to whom the people had trusted their lives."
The family told me that Dad was in the hospital. Well, he was for a long time.
Right.
But when he was in prison,
Because after
I just thought he was still in the hospital.
Right. Because after the accident, he was put in prison for how many years?
3 years.
3 years.
When Jack was released, his boilerman's ticket got him a job at a local factory. He died just 5 years later.
He was just a very broken man, really. It affected my mother a great deal. She got hate mail. At one stage, she had no money, and she didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And that day, she got a letter from an aunt who lived in Australia with £5 in it. And that would have been a fortune about then.
Patricia's experience illustrates that when we step away from the villains and victims of a disaster like this one, we are still left with the human cost. Families that had seen loved ones leave for war and were accustomed to hardship, in an instant saw their lives ripped apart by a tragic accident. And the effects of that disaster are still felt to this day. The derailment of locomotive AB 782 was caused by excessive speed and a lack of judgment on the part of a tired and aging driver. For Central Otago, a moment in history when time stood still.
On that fateful day, June 1943, 21 innocent people lost their lives.
It was meant to be a holiday adventure to the races and winter show in Dunedin. Instead, it ended in catastrophe.
But this is a story that isn't just about the dead, it's also about the living, and how families and communities have continued to live on despite all that was lost that day.
To hear these stories, these deeply personal experiences, has been a privilege.